We can work with 34-month-old babies on sleep difficulties, colic, etc., under the guidance of a pediatrician.
You can. What behaviors do you see from a family perspective? Specifically, children's tendency to hold back pee, or their refusal to poop, their insistence on holding it in, etc. What do these mean in terms of sensory integration?
In terms of sensory integration, these are related to the child's internal system, which we call interoceptive. We can often interpret this through more psychological processes. We often bring up this topic with psychologists and psychiatrists. One Sunday, they weren't active all day, so we made them sit down to do homework. It's boring. They rightfully want to satisfy their need for movement first.
They want it served to them on separate plates. What does this indicate? The visual system is significantly strengthened, and screen-free behavior isn't something we should be.
Too resistant to, meaning screen-free. When we say that we should all definitely be screen-free by age 3, I think we should consider the child's developmental milestones after age 3.
Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we'll be discussing a crucial topic for children: sensory integration issues and solutions. My guest is Mr. Onur Aşkar, an expert and physiotherapist. Welcome.
We found it very pleasant.
This topic really excites me. It feels like the answers to so many questions about children are right here.
Mostly, isn't it?
Question mark. Now, what is sensory integration? Let's start there, if you'd like. There are 5 senses we generally know. I know you'll add more senses to these. You'll also add lesser known ones within the scope of sensory integration. What are your thoughts? Let's expand on this concept a bit. Of course, sensory integration is a person's ability to interpret sensory stimuli from the environment in the brain and respond accordingly. And this is a normal process, a normal situation. The 5 senses we all know in sensory integration are touch, vision, hearing, smell, and taste. But in addition, we have 3 more senses that provide us with information about our bodies. And this has been particularly well known and popular over the last 10 to 15 years. The first is the vestibular sense, or the center of balance. The second is the proprioceptive sense, or the muscle joint system. The third is the interoceptive system, or the internal system. Why are these 3 senses important? Because by commenting on our bodies, we convey information about our bodies, positions, interests, communication, and relationships with the environment. They convey information. So, if there's a sensory integration disorder, what's the definition? The definition is actually a direct definition of sensory integration disorder. We don't call it a diagnosis, as you're aware, because it's not a disease. It's a disorder. It's a disorder. It's a state of being disrupted. The beauty of a disorder is that it can often be compensated for and corrected. That's why we can easily recover from these changes with support. I want to ask this question about reversibility. What's the age for parents, for example, for children? Is there a limit? We could say there's no limit, but of course, the mechanism of action becomes more difficult as behavioral responses become involved. That's why we place significant importance on the ages of 3 to 6. Ages 3 to 6 are also important, but I prioritize 3 to 6 more. Because the age of 3, along with the ongoing development of mother-baby father-baby bonding processes, also presents disadvantages for us in terms of therapy. We asked about the upper limit. Let me ask you about 6. We can work with 34-month-old babies on sleep difficulties and colic, under the guidance of a pediatrician.
You can. These kinds of disorders can be detected in them from very early on. So, whether this is a disorder, what behaviors and situations do families notice when a child has a sensory integration disorder, and when do they come to you? We
usually say this: the first thing that matters to us is the disruption of the daily routine. We could say we need to sound the alarm.
Disruptions in the child's life.
Disruptions in daily life, and decreased tolerance in the parents. They usually see this as their own fault, but sometimes it can be difficult to care for the child. So, please don't see this as a problem there, and they may sometimes attribute this decreased tolerance to the child's sensory problems.
So, in this case, can it arise due to reasons like decreased tolerance in the parents, repetitive behaviors in the child, or failure to heed warnings?
Exactly. It can manifest as interpreting environmental stimuli more intensely and responding to them more strongly.
In what kinds of situations, such as eating disorders or tactile sensitivities, are examples?
These are the first 2 things you mentioned. The third is difficulty with self-care skills. We can experience various situations like not wanting to wash hands, having difficulty showering, having difficulty with potty training, or wetting ourselves in the toilet at work. In addition, difficulties adjusting to school, not wanting to go to the park, or not wanting to play with playground materials when we go there, which is exactly what we call a disruption to the flow of the day. This constant occurrence and the weakening of mutual tolerance are important factors for us. You mentioned toileting. Now, in that period you mentioned, especially between the ages of 3 and 6 and before, children tend to hold back pee, or they don't poop, insist on holding it in, etc. What do these mean in terms of sensory integration? In terms of sensory integration, these are mostly related to the child's internal system, which we call the interoceptive system. We can also interpret this through more psychological processes. We bring this issue up a lot, especially with psychologists and psychiatrists. We have a unit here that helps create the eating mechanism. That's why they can do this, to convey the message that I'm the one who decides. Sensory-wise, the deep pressure from the distended bladder relaxes the child, providing a stimulus. Exactly. Furthermore, situations like reluctance to interrupt play, seeking movement and stimulation but not realizing it, give us a lot of information about toileting. Of course.
You also conduct sessions with psychologists at your center, right? So, you're actually approaching the issue from a multifaceted perspective.
I absolutely make the initial assessments. I definitely want a psychologist or psychiatrist's opinion regarding the child's development.
Yes. So, when children have problems with learning and concentration, when social skills are affected, how should we assess this from Dubu's perspective?
Teachers usually provide us with a lot of information about the child's learning and social skill challenges. Beyond that, families can clearly see this. They have difficulty getting children to sit down with homework, especially in first and second grade children. The process takes a long time when they do. I know of cases like homework refusal in fourth grade, but there are factors like the fact that it's truly disrupting the flow of the day and causing them to avoid school. Every child avoids homework to some extent anyway. That's normal. Or, without knowing their sensory needs and sensory landscape at home, a child might avoid homework if they're approached inappropriately. Therefore, it's important to understand a child's sensory needs and whether they're satisfied. Let's give an example. One Sunday, they didn't stay up all day, so we made them sit down to do homework. It's very boring. They rightfully want to satisfy their need for movement first. If they still struggle with that task after satisfying their need for movement, we can actually understand some avoidance behavior.
Now, what you mentioned refers to threshold differences related to the senses, right? Regarding the question I asked, you used the concept of satiation and insatiation. So, how can a parent tell if a child is satisfied with a sensory stimulus? When the child's movements become irregular.
When a stimulus becomes too much, we can give the example of a screen. For example, some families might say, after an hour of watching, they start to get confused and disorganized. I'm saying that means we need to cut back, because there will be too much color, movement, and stimulation. It's the same at the park. He started pushing a friend a little. He doesn't mean any harm, by the way, and he doesn't mean to. When this kind of behavior starts, know that he's either trying to get attention or he's sensory overloaded. We also call this sensory overload. To release that load, the child's different sensory systems need to work and integrate into the system. We felt this right at this point. For example, after an hour of watching the screen, what do you suggest we can do at home to help them regulate their behavior? What about the kids who are already crawling around on the couches? That's exactly what's essential for us at home. Instead of constantly saying, don't fall, don't do it, we need to find a solution. And that's tiring for parents. Putting cushions on the floor and having them jump on them. There's a lot of tumbling. Children love to tumble, and we get very anxious at home. They worry about whether their necks will hurt. We need to facilitate that. It plays a role in facilitating the child's energy release, facilitating their reception of stimuli like balance center stimulation and muscle joint system stimulation. Another important thing for us here is to include them in daily household chores. The kitchen is a prime example of this. Usually, 3 meals a day are prepared in the kitchen, but when we're home, especially if we include them in 3 of these, you gain 3 to 4 hours of time.
Now, we also confine children to their rooms, between those 4 walls. They can no longer play in the neighborhood or on the streets like we did. What transformations and changes do you see there? The
biggest transformation I see there is social withdrawal, shyness in children. They might get into a game if you push them a little, but we don't want that pushing anymore. In other words, we want the child to be able to initiate things on their own and do it in a safe space. I think it's become very difficult for 34 children to play at the same time. They're divided again. They're 2 against 2. They begin to divide themselves according to their own schedules, their sensory profiles, and build their play systems around them. That's why groups like social skills groups are established, so children can play together. As you said, we're essentially having to
revert to the structured way children used to play together in the neighborhood. Now, one of the most challenging issues for mothers is children who are picky eaters. Yes. And what does this translate into in sensory integration?
There are a few things about food. The first is picky eating, rejecting certain types of food. The second is difficulty with the texture of food. These two things need to be distinguished from each other, because the two have very different therapeutic implications. Separating these involves looking at the parents' eating habits, the household's nutritional infrastructure, what's in the refrigerator and cupboards, what's in the food culture, where are the parents from. All of these play a role here. There are many factors, such as how many days a week meals are cooked at home, how many times they eat out, and how many times they order from outside. But if all factors indicate there's no problem with food at home, but the child has difficulties with it, we recommend therapy support or evaluation because the flow is disrupted. Because food is really on the agenda. Well, when we go places, food is now a form of socialization. Exactly, going to different places. So, we also hear this. Mothers and fathers of 78-year-old children carry things with them to the hotel. This is seriously tiring. Making things easier for these situations is truly valuable, because food is a serious source of stress, taking up perhaps 3 to 4 hours of the day, especially in the 06-year-old age group, and it's brought up 56 times a day: breakfast, lunch, afternoon snack, and dinner.
I'd also like to ask this. For example, chickpeas and rice were placed side by side on a plate in front of us, and we used to eat them. Now, children don't want to see them together. They want them served separately, on the same plate. What does this indicate? The sensory and
visual systems have become significantly stronger. This is because they are a group growing up with new generation technology, which has significantly strengthened their visual systems, and they are constantly fed visual stimuli. So, I don't see this as pathological. If they're eating from two separate plates and gagging and don't show any pathological response to it, that's not a problem. But of course, we recommend gradually getting them used to using the same plate, because it won't happen today, but tomorrow, the plates will be combined at school and at the hotel. They'll encounter this somewhere they go, and they shouldn't let it ruin their day.
Because when it ruins their life, it actually starts to become a serious challenge for parents. That's why planning and organizing those spaces correctly is so important. You mentioned technology. Let me make a point. We talked briefly about screens a moment ago, but regarding children's future, we're talking about a generation so immersed in the internet and screens. They love screens through tasks, homework, the internet, and tablets. Because we've actually talked about the reason. The fact that neighborhood culture no longer exists is also a factor. How do you think children will change in this regard in the future? Sensory.
I foresee a slight decline in their social skills. But I don't think so. I'm very pessimistic. Every generation sees the next generation as bad. It's been said since the time of Aristotle, there's a saying that a worse generation is coming. He has a text. I don't see it that way. As children become adults and their environment changes, everyone starts to adapt.
They will adapt to the new era.
Exactly. And it can complicate our thinking. They may crave more. They may start to constantly demand more stimulation. The auditory system works this way too, along with the visual system. Beyond that, I think attention is very variable right now. Focusing, maintaining attention. Absolutely. The issue of distraction is a hot topic, but I also care about this. We all know we can live with distraction.
Yes.
It can turn into a torture during very busy periods, but other than that, I don't see any serious problems. In a place like Istanbul, we can handle this. It's called challenging. We can achieve it. So, on the other hand, it doesn't seem right to me to describe it in such a definitive way.
So, in this sense, is there anything parents can do about the possibilities you've listed? Precautionary
measures. In fact, the path to prevention starts from the very beginning. Not being too resistant to screen time, that's not what screen-free means. When we say that we should all definitely be screen-free at 3, I think we should decide based on the child's development after 3. Because some doctors or experts may not object to a child being exposed to screens at 2. When a child speaks and their skills are good, I say this: there's no TV at home. Parents aren't interested in screens at all. They can see it at 67.
There's no limit to 3. Yes, they don't say what it is, because the child learns the moment they see it. But we seriously consider the minimum age of 3 now. So, what can be done besides screens for children who are seeking screens and need more visual stimulation?
Besides screens, I think the things we recommend most often are for ages 6, 7, and 8. Board games and visual games are the same things. Because they involve finding small objects, maintaining a memory, performing a task, maintaining attention, those kinds of games, or what we call open-ended games we played in our own childhoods. We think that games like catch, chase, and rope jumping, which have uncertain endings and constantly changing outcomes, and offer variety in terms of sensory responses, are much more beneficial.
Now, the holidays are coming. It's midterm break. We're home again. The children are home. Therefore, they'll be transitioning from one process, from their school routines, to another routine at home. Do you think there will be a change in needs, in terms of sensory needs, here? It
varies a lot, from family to family, from dynamic to dynamic. Well, my advice to families there is to maintain that routine when they're happy and comfortable with their own routine, and not to get too hung up on bookish information. I mean this in this sense. Of course, I'm not saying to have 10 hours of screen time a day, but just because a child watches 2 hours has increased to 2.5, it's not right to respond with something like, yes, look, you increased it by half an hour, it's chaos. Well, during the holidays, teacher, when we provide screens, the situation changes dramatically. That's why we don't provide screens. If you don't provide screens and can manage them, I say continue like that. Because, as I said, it varies depending on the dynamics of each family. During the midterm breaks, some parents work more, some work less, some have time, and some are at home. As I said, there are a lot of dynamics. The best way to manage these dynamics correctly and decide based on the child's needs.
But do you think spending time outside is necessary during this time?
I would say it is. It's November anyway. We're not in a very bad time seasonally, and I'm more like someone who thinks more like northern countries. Let them go out, wear warm clothes, and go out. Yes, let them play in the snow. I see so many families who don't let them play in the snow. This surprises me. Yes, they're more protective. They protect them more when it rains, and pediatricians also recommend it a lot now. We know very well that the increased oxygenation after rain and the exposure to nature are actually good for children and relieve depression, because childhood depression, and the depressions of our time, have increased significantly, and I'm not talking about this on a psychological level.
What causes them to be depressed?
Yes, they do, unfortunately, and we can see things like speech delays and poor social skills because of this. Yes, but I'm not saying this diagnostically. What I'm actually referring to here is unhappiness, or a lack of intrinsic motivation. So, the fact that we're trying to persuade a child to play often bothers me. This should be voluntary, enthusiastic, and exciting. Yes, absolutely. We'll
take these and implement them in a controlled manner. Why should we open the back of the pen a little bit for the child?
Think of it like someone biting their nails to focus on a task, or someone who wants to eat snacks while doing something, or someone who constantly drinks tea or coffee when they need to focus on a task. Oral habits are generally a good habit. This is an extreme example, but it's like smoking addiction. Someone who quits smoking starts eating roasted chickpeas. They always want oral stimulation.
Cigarettes are more harmful.
Absolutely. How do we transform this here? We develop regulatory skills by massaging the mouth with vibrating toothbrushes, and by massaging the cheeks and face directly with the mother's finger, gradually helping them quit. The gum issue is okay. Well, I agree, but the sugar issue isn't gum, as it takes them to a different level. Yes, I didn't mean sugar-free candy for children anyway. We look at it in such detail. That's why it's a question mark. There are also dentists who say that chewing gum has a disadvantage regarding tooth development. Excessive chewing can damage a developing jaw structure, so that recommendation isn't so clear-cut. It could be much healthier, definitely.
Nuts, hard fruits, for that matter. So, those who come to you and bring their children, those who want sensory integration therapy, and those you deem suitable for therapy, yes, they do want to. Because I know you don't want every child to take it. And you clearly guide families on this issue. At what stage do you bring a child into therapy?
Let's think of 3 points at the point where we bring a child into therapy. The mother-father-child triangle. If there's a difficulty in one of these triangles, it doesn't necessarily have to be the child's fault. We can raise a question mark if the child's activity or level of stimulation affects the mother or father. Or we can refer them to a parent group for psychological support. But if the child has difficulty at school, for me, it's definitely a reason for therapy. If they have learning difficulties, it's definitely a reason for therapy. And if they have problem behavior, it's definitely a reason for therapy. These 3 are critical for me. We observing clumsiness and incoordination in many children? Or do I think it's a lot? Well, because the musculoskeletal system isn't receiving the information we want anymore. We don't move much. We don't jump. We don't skip. The system you recommend with the presence balls is actually very valuable in strengthening that system, because it's not right to constantly label a child as clumsy. There are many children who are very unhappy because they are clumsy, who we know are very unhappy, who struggle a lot, and who exhibit social withdrawal. Therefore, when we see clumsiness, we definitely call it physiotherapy-based sensory integration therapy, along with a detailed assessment of the child, because that's where the problem completely comes down to the musculoskeletal system.
This process is so important in the musculoskeletal system. So, what else would you recommend at home besides those weighted balls?
Exercises to strengthen posture, imitation in front of a mirror, and plenty of walking to promote physical imitation and physical awareness. Walking is one of the muscle joint system's greatest allies. Yes, I always recommend it for children. Have them walk, go uphill, or walk on uneven surfaces. Because everything we do there will stimulate the brain regarding different sensory components of the muscular system, making the child's daily life easier.
What's the reason for this forward bending and increasingly rounded appearance in children's posture?
Well, inactivity is actually the most fundamental. The spine stays alive and well with movement. We need to increase mobility. Babies and children who avoid the prone position, and babies who don't crawl, are much more likely to encounter such situations in the future.
Continuing the prone position after crawling, providing exercises there, and, for example, having them read books face down is a healthy behavior.
Absolutely. Yes, I don't see any disadvantages to the prone position for children of all ages.
The developed back muscles will counteract the reality of movement. Yes, thank you very much. You've provided valuable information. Thank you. We truly learned some very important information. Mr. Aşkar was my guest today. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye until we meet in another episode.